Hello, YouTube. I'm Tamara Westwood, and welcome to my hangout. So glad you could join me. Sit back, relax, and engage if you like.
The jump room that we called the corkscrew. One time when I was exiting that corkscrew jump room after arriving on Mars with Courtney M. Hunt of the CIA and my fellow trainee and chrononaut William B. Stillings. And I yelled out, Court, Hunt, Court, Brett, a gray on the roof observing us. And then they came out and they could still see he was squatting up on the roof looking down at us exiting the building. So that group was very, very furtive in its movements, almost stealthy, and we had no direct contact with that type of Martian. So I did also have contact with one of the second typology who showed up outside one of the jump rooms and walked Courtney Hunt and I to go on a tour of a part of the underground civilization. It's just sort of like a look-see at one little branch of an underground civilization, which was sort of Tolkien-esque. It was underground. They had things like elevators with pneumatic tubing. It was kind of like going down into Carlsbad Caverns in that sense, in New Mexico. And their design was very fanciful. There were sort of sweeping roofs and paisley designs embedded into the caverns. It was very much a storybook kind of fanciful underground, but I can't see how it was easy for them to sustain their food supply and water supply in those kinds of conditions.
Interesting. Now, let's get back to some of the experiences that you had with the crew. Now, you mentioned interacting with Barack Obama's mother.
Yes.
Can you tell me about that?
Well, there were three parents who attended every lecture, and they were my father, Brett's father, and Stanley Ann Dunham. Why do I know it was Stanley Ann Dunham? Well, outside the Creamery restaurant in Weed, California, around September 7th or 8th of 1980, she was actually having a cigarette, and Barry was just sort of standing around. And I said, I don't believe Barry gave me your name. And so I went over and greeted his mom, because they were sort of auditing the class, sort of sitting behind us during the lectures. I would be sitting maybe 3/4 of the way back in the center of class, and Barry was over on my right, maybe one desk forward, and then William Stillings was sitting behind Barry, and then our parents were behind the three of us. And so she said, Stanley Ann Dunham. And I said, oh, that's an unusual name for a woman. My brother-in-law's grandfather's name is Doris.
Okay.
Because they had liked the name, or they wanted a girl. And I said, how are you named Stanley, which is usually a male name? And she said, oh, my father wanted a boy, and they liked the name, and he's Stanley Armour Dunham, and so I was named for my father. So sometimes I'm called Ann. And we had also had more extensive contact with her than just sitting there when she gave an afternoon lecture on cross-cultural communications. And in that lecture, she described how she knew more than the average academic or foreign aid official about cross-cultural communications, because during her life she had married gentlemen variously from Kenya and from Indonesia. And so she drew on her personal experience as an American woman married to men from other countries to talk about cross-cultural communications. And she was essentially preparing us for the eventuality that we would have to communicate on the surface with Martians.
With Martians, right.
It was an excellent lecture, and I can see how she later went on to earn a PhD at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I mean, she was a very gifted intellect, and it was a fascinating lecture. So that was the extent of my interactions with Stanley Ann Dunham, but she was a brilliant woman, very friendly. She had a trenchant sense of humor, so every once in a while she would chime in during the lectures and make a joke, just as Brett's father did. My dad was a little bit less comedic, but you know, she would. It was a very enjoyable class. It was fascinating. It was overhung by periodic panic attacks and dread. Typically, we would have beer keg parties at night where we would just talk rapidly, downloading what Ed Dames had covered in that day's class. You know, because we were being prepared to go to another planet and maybe not come home.
Wow.
So it was an extremely excellent lecture series, and Stanley Ann Dunham's lecture only improved it. But at the same time, it was all sort of terrifying. Sometimes I would sit there in my chair and go, I can't really believe that I'm enrolled in this. What is my dad getting me into? But I'd had experiences where he had also involved me in the activities of the technical community. So I realized that I had a special destiny. I might as well buck up and go. And I went.
And
as did all the other trainings.
Now, during your involvement in the Mars Jump Room project, what were your interactions with Barack Obama?
When I look back, they were extensive, and there may have been a presidential angle on that. So it's very complicated. So let me just answer your immediate question, which is my interactions. First, I met him in class. The first time I remember saying anything significant was we were walking out of class, and Barry made a very intelligent point that I think was kind of on the mind of many of us. And he walked alongside me as I was walking to my dad's car with my late father. And he said, sometimes I can't even believe what we're doing. We're going to be doing something that either no or few human beings have done in the history of our planet, for all we know, and that is go to another planet. And I said, I know. I'm always thinking about how it's going to feel with my feet, upside down, realizing that the earth is over my head. And he said, I know, man, I can't believe it, but we're having an opportunity in this period of human history to do it. So we might as well go, right? And I said, yeah. We're being given the opportunity to be astronauts, basically. Secret astronauts, but astronauts nonetheless. So that was the first time I met him. And then later in class, we were going into class, and we just, again, commiserated about some of the course material. And I said, listen, man, what's your name? And he said, Barry. And I said, what? Barry what? He said, Barry Satoro, which was his Indonesian surname. And I said, oh, the cadence of our names is kind of similar. My name's Andy Basiago, Barry Satoro, pleased to meet you, now, formally. Now, that was maybe in the first week of class, those two discussions with Barry. We then got to know each other in class. I remember he had a great sense of humor. Every time Ed was making one of his kind of sick jokes, I remember seeing Barry kind of doubling over at his desk laughing. So I could see he had a really good sense of humor. And at one point, about 2.5 weeks into those 3 weeks, now this is where the story gets complicated. Ed Daines and my father, who was the technical liaison between the Ralph M. Parsons Company and CIA on teleportation, asked Barry, Regina Dugan, and myself to come with my dad and Ed and meet in Ed Daines' office. And they explained that we had been selected to write, each of us to write a thesis utilizing about 4 inches of French intelligence documents pertaining strictly to the humanoid civilization on Mars, and spent several months in seclusion there writing our thesis about whether or not the Martian humanoids population presented a threat to our humanoid civilization on Earth, or it could not be determined. So there were three thesis answers we could give and then have to defend. That was being done throughout the intelligence community. In fact, Bernard Mendez said that threat assessment regarding the Martian humanoid civilization ultimately went to about 10,000 pages, and presumably our theses would have been in that document. My French at that point was minimal. I had done 2 years of French in junior high school, 2 years in high school, and I was only able to decipher about 25% of the document, primarily by identifying Latin and Greek stems in French and basic cognates in the Romance languages. And I knew a little bit of Spanish at that point as well, having studied it poorly in my first year of college. So I was deciphering some of the French just based on cognates with Spanish, but I didn't really know everything the documents were revealing. Now, how did they embed several months of working on that threat assessment into a 3-week course? What they did is have us teleport to the beginning of the summer. And Ed said, facetiously, he said, I know you do because I greeted you there. And we said, when? He said, the beginning of the summer. I've already met you 3. So you're going to meet me, but right now, as I'm telling you in real time, as I'm sending you there at the beginning of the summer, I'm now sending you on a mission where I've already received you. And so we then spent several months sequestered in the dorms there at College of the Siskiyous, later a group of us would calve off and stay at the Finlandia Motel in Mount Shasta, California. So I got to know Barry initially as a roommate when we were sequestered to work on the threat assessment, and as a conversant, because we could talk about the data among the three of us, but the rules were we couldn't talk about our conclusions, intermediate or final, about the ultimate question regarding the Martian humanoids, whether or not they were a threat. So we were interacting, sharing with each other during these long afternoons what we were deciphering in the French. I remember that Regina's French was a lot more proficient, so she was helping us a lot decipher the French intelligence documents. So I spent several days sharing that dorm room with Barry. He was a true gentleman. I remember when he would come out of the shower, he would always be dressed in a cotton robe. You know, in other words, he was a modest person. He was always a considerate roommate. And then another room opened up, and I moved out, and so all three of us had our own rooms for the summer. And then we interacted walking over to Ed Dane's office with our completed theses, and Regina and I had kind of an argument where I had concluded that since we were breaking ranks now because we were turning the documents in, I revealed that I had concluded that the Martian humanoid civilization was not a threat to our civilization on Earth. Regina said she thought it was, at least potentially, when we were on the surface. And Barry, who had become president, at least the first president from that group, revealed that nothing. He wouldn't tell us what he had concluded because he didn't want to break rank until he literally physically delivered his thesis to Ed. So then we were back in the class. Then a group of us were over at the Finlandia Motel. One of the interesting sidebars is I think that it's pretty clear that both Barry and I were quite enamored of Regina. So there was a little bit of competition there.
Oh.
I certainly regarded him as a competing heterosexual male. As a husband and father, I think that's pretty easy to conclude without that vignette,
Sure.
without that anecdote. But you know, we were clearly interested in Regina. She was very attractive, very intelligent, and a wonderful person. So I think it's clear we both had crushes on her, and were certainly competing for her attention. And so I got to know him as a human being, and he's a great guy. And that's one of the reasons I'm speaking out now, that, you know, when I've been asked, what was Barack Obama like at 19, 20, 21 years old when you were in the jump room program with him? And I say, look, well, how many people did I meet when I was at UCLA? Probably during those 5 years, because I was a fifth-year senior. I did a year at UC San Diego, and then I did 4 years at UCLA. So I probably met, in every social context, about 2,000 same-age peers. Maybe a couple years older or younger, but I got a good sense of my generation and the personalities in it during going to UCLA, you know, the big U. And the way I describe it is, you know, Barry wasn't the most intelligent classmate that I had. He was certainly one of the most talented, but the bottom line is that if I was to draft a list of who I would trust with the U.S. presidency among all those 2,000 same-age peers that I went to college with, or that I met in different college functions, going to other colleges, I would put Barack Obama at the top of the list. And that is to say, it's my feeling that something much more significant happened than just the first election of an African American as president. I think that despite the bitterness and unfairness with which people respond to public officials in this era, where there's a lack of respect even for the quality people in government, that the American people did something very organically healthy when they elected this man our president. He's an exemplary individual. Certain things I look back that he did that were so unusual but go to his ultimate character. Let me just give you one example. When we were at parties and somebody would say something bigoted regarding anybody's indelible characteristics of any kind, from being a person from another race or religion to somebody having a speech impediment or something. If anybody ever said anything bigoted, Barry wouldn't say anything, but he would sharply turn his back to that person and shun them, basically communicating the message, why are you shunning this person? Here's what it's like to feel shunned. And he would literally turn his back on the person. Okay, so I noticed that. I saw that happen, not in regard to myself, but a couple times sort of in the beer party type setting. I also remember that unlike a lot of politically active people and intellectuals, the understanding of the world and life and political philosophy that Barry was pursuing at that age did not involve any egoic projection on his part. In other words, he was studying what other people thought about moral and political issues before reaching his own conclusion. Now that's good and bad. It might involve a little less passion in terms of ideology, although he certainly has been a speechifier regarding his ideology as a candidate and as president. But what I mean is he was studying what the appropriate positions were as much as arriving at them just through his own exercise of his own mind or argument. That was very clear. We had many, many political discussions because we were both political animals. I wasn't involved in student government. I'm not sure that he was either. But I was certainly both writing for the Bruin and writing for other publications in LA. I would later meet him again in LA as a result of his activism trying to end apartheid in South Africa. But Barry's high intelligence combined with his humility, I think, made him an excellent trainee for the presidency. In other words, during those years after whatever age he arrived at the desire to become president, and certainly with his foreknowledge from the CIA that he would win when he ran for president, I think he really did his homework. He was also being given papers. So, for example, during those several days that we roomed together at College of the Siskiyous, he showed me some of the policy papers that were being forwarded to him. I remember one of them was a paper entitled "The U.S. Presidency in the American Constitutional System." And if I'm not mistaken, it was written by Dr. Lawrence Tribe of Harvard Law School, who would go on to be one of Barack Obama's law professors, and somebody who has said that he was in the top 3 of all time of all of his law students. Now look at that statement. Dr. Tribe of Harvard, somebody who's been named as a potential Supreme Court selection, describing Barack Obama in a 40-year career at Harvard Law School as one of his top students. That's what I want the American people to know about the individual that they selected. It was an excellent selection. So it didn't just go beyond the legacy, the persisting legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, but in opening up more of a diversified field of potential candidates for the presidency. But it was a fine selection on the merits, and that's never discussed. We've had some good presidents, some mediocre presidents, and some bad presidents, and I think in terms of his inherent talent and intellect and morality, Barack Obama was a superb choice by the American people, because I had the privilege of being a colleague and certainly a friendly acquaintance of Barry's when he was just a young man, and he was a great guy. We all liked him. One of his great skills that I remember is in that kind of college party setting, he was the most persuasively likable person you could meet. He always made the other person like themselves or feel better, and he was always very charismatic in that one-on-one or one-on-two kind of setting. He just put the rest of us to shame in terms of being a natural politician, a naturally likable and thoughtful individual. And so that's the Barry Soetoro, as he was known then, that I knew. And I think it was a great thing that he was elected president, not simply because it broke the color barrier in the White House, but because he was elected. And that's something that's a major point that I want to make.
Oh, I'm so glad that you brought that up. You know, there's been so much negative press about our president of late, and I do appreciate that statement. Now, speaking of the presidency, I hear that it was pre-spoken, that somehow someone peered into the future and stated that Barack Obama would be elected president.
Yes, and indeed myself. So this gets even more complicated. You have to remember that when the Mars program was launched in 1980, the U.S. had been working on time travel for almost 15 years. So among the things they began around 1970 is using some of the time travel technologies to learn things about future events. And of course, survival and peace in the nuclear age relied on them identifying who would be president. And what happened during the Jump Room program is germane to the way in which time travel related to the U.S. presidency. Tamara, do I still have your signal? Tamara? Yeah, I lost you there for a second.
Looks like there was a little bit of a glitch, but I'm here.
Transmission glitch, yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Great, great. Something that happened, a couple of things that happened during the jump room training in summer of '80 articulate or evidence the way that time travel relates to the U.S. presidency, which has been a major part of my truth campaign, because certainly the framers of the U.S. Constitution could not anticipate that quantum access provided by time travel technology being possessed by agencies that hadn't even been created yet, like the CIA, created, of course, in 1947, not in 1787, have affected the way in which the permanent government, the permanent secret government, has been relating to future presidents. So let me describe what happened during summer of '80. Barry got up, he was sitting in front of us, he got up to talk to Major Dames, and Thomas J. Stillings leaned forward into the aisle between Brett and his dad and myself and my late father, and said to Brett, he said, "Brett, how do you feel being in a Mars program like this with a future president?" And nodded to Barry. And before Brett could look back from Barry back to his dad, my dad leaned forward in the aisle between our two rows of chairs and thrust out two fingers and looked at me with his eye twitching and said, "Two future presidents." Now, Brett can verify this, and I'm not saying I now have to become president because my colleague was, or because I have to be anyway. I'm just saying I'm running in 2015, and this is the backstory regarding prior knowledge of presidents held by some people in the intelligence community. The second incident was when we were at our end of the seminar party at the Creamery restaurant in Weed, and I was sitting with Barry diagonally to my right and his mother sitting on his left. And Stanley Andeno spent the better part of that dinner describing how Barry was going to be president, not as an ambitious mom, but speaking of it as a future fait accompli, as another person with the CIA, how Barry had been identified as such. And during that discussion, Stanley looked across at the table when I said, "You know, it's going to be an auspicious thing when you're president, Barry," as if perhaps I will someday have the same privilege. And she winked at me. Okay, so I don't know what that meant, but we know to a minimum that one of the young men being identified by the CIA people who were auditing the seminar, that summer class, were aware of the Obama presidency, that Barry held this particular destiny, indeed was already being forwarded readings to start building his understanding of presidential issues, which is what he had described to me. The third time I had an encounter with a young Barack Obama and his presidency was discussed was in a completely different context. I had been having a discussion on Bruin Walk on the UCLA's Westwood campus with a white South African anti-apartheid activist who was pamphleteering there on Bruin Walk regarding divestment by the University of California from South Africa as a mechanism for defunding of the apartheid regime. And I was discussing some of my ideas about the role that the transnational corporations would have in the future, because in this person's discussions with UCLA students who were stopping by his table, he was talking about going after corporate investment in South Africa. So we were talking about the impact of corporations on society. And I was sharing some of the things I was reading around that time. I was reading the works of Scott Nearing, who was not just a socialist, but sort of a futurist regarding creating possibly a large pro-social corporation, a social service corporation. And I had just interviewed fairly recently, in October of '81, I had interviewed Buckminster Fuller around the time that Fuller was writing his book, Grunch of Giants, which is about the transnational corporations and whither they were tending as a reality in our lives and in international society. And he said, "You know, I have a house guest who would be fascinated to learn about your meeting with Buckminster Fuller and what he had to say about the corporations." So I drove with this complete stranger. It was the only time in college that I got into somebody's vehicle from campus, you know, a stranger's vehicle from campus. It was a Volkswagen, and we drove over to a house that he had rented near about San Vicente and Bundy, if you're familiar with Los Angeles.
Exactly where that is.
Yeah, right on the sort of the northern side of West LA. And we came into the house, and he went to put something on the dining room table, and Barack Obama came out of the kitchen and introduced himself. And I said, that's a very unusual name, and I began sort of questioning the validity of taking an ethnically significant name in adulthood. And I gave a Polish-American example of that. In other words, we were very political, right? So there was always an opportunity to offend somebody when you were in college. And so I said, you know, I think that's as, you know, calling yourself Barack Obama is, and I didn't realize it was Barry Soetoro from the Jump Room program, because he was older and taller and thinner and more assertive and more in motion in life. He was acting more proactive. And this was literally, I think, around the time of the beginning of his political career, which was 1983. And he gave me a different name. So I thought I didn't even think about Barry Soetoro from the Jump Room program, although right when his friend turned away, Barry looked back at me and said, "We know each other, don't we?" And I said, "I don't think so," because I didn't realize it was Barry from the program, because he said his name was Barack something. So I was kind of teasing him, or sort of challenging the authenticity of changing your name to add a cultural depth to it, as it were, cultural significance to your background. And he said, no, and this, I think, goes to the birther controversy. He said, "No, man, that was my father's name. He was from Africa." He didn't emphasize it that way, but he said he was from Africa. He was Barack Obama Sr., and I'm Barack Obama Jr. So in that offhand way, when he was referring to his identity as his father's son, he distinguished the fact that his father was from Africa, and implicitly that he wasn't. Another thing I might add as an attorney is something about the birther controversy that really bothers me is when you're trying to prove a ministerial act, like a wedding, marriage certificate, a death certificate, or a birth certificate, the best evidence rule obtains. In order to prove it, the first document that the court must rely on is the certificate itself. Now, when the best evidence cannot be entered into evidence because it doesn't exist or it can't be found, the next best evidence is the most probative of what you're asserting. Now, what's the next best evidence in the Obama birther controversy? It is clearly the ancient document of the announcement in the Honolulu Advertiser about the birth of President Obama to his parents. That comes in as an ancient document, as an exception to the rule against hearsay. It even trumps what a relative of his would have said in Kenya after he became president, because clearly a 40 or 50-year-old document, and literally an article in a newspaper, has more probative value than something that a relative may say in Kenya to establish that they're not just related to the American president, but that he's a fellow Kenyan. So everybody has ignored the fact that if the Obama controversy was literally tried in the manner of a fully fledged court case, criminal or otherwise, administrative or what have you, that evidence would be relied on to establish that he's a Hawaiian, even if he isn't. So there's no controversy. He's a Hawaiian as a result of what the evidence shows.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Well, you know, a little question has come to me that here you are, Barack Obama is spoken of as a future president, and so are you. Why in the world will they put the two of you in a Mars jump program? What's that about?
Right, let me just go back one tick. I just want to say, in that meeting at the South Africans rental house, he ended the debate about the corporations that Barry and I had by saying, "You better be nice to him, Andy. He's going to be president." He didn't say it as an ambition. He said, again, just like Stanley Ann Dunham, said it as a fait accompli, because clearly Barry had informed him of what Barry's destiny held as president. Now, why would they throw two future presidents together if, in fact, if we were to assume arguendo that I reached the presidency, which I was told I would? I don't know if I will. Maybe another timeline will open up and I'll do something else with my future. But it seems to me that it was their understanding that I also will reach the presidency. You know, I don't know. One theory is we were unconventional presidents or future presidents of the same generation, born a month apart, 45 days apart. So they wanted us to establish a fast friendship so that we would consult. There would be a foundation for a friendship to exist there, so we would be able to consult as either consecutive or just myself as a later president, with Barry as presumably a living former president. It may have been that we were being recruited to join the cadre of visitors because they knew our future held being president, which proto-causally implied that we would survive the jump room experience. So that may have been a way of preserving the advantage of the jump room program by selecting people with illustrious futures that they knew about via quantum access and had already studied. They had identified, for example, future presidents, probably other principal political leaders, cultural change agents and so forth, your Bill Gates and so forth, technologists. So they may have just been working from the CIA's quantum access data regarding the presidents and said, wait a minute, if we put Andy and Barry in the jump room program, they're going to live because we have the forward intelligence data regarding their futures as president. Now, another thing is they know that the presidents have been coping not just with survival and peace in a nuclear age, but with a growing cadre of seemingly unsolvable problems, overwhelming problems. So the presidency has become, as we've noted, an opportunity not only to serve the people of the United States and the world, but certainly a professional environment in which the individual really ages from stress.
Oh, my goodness,
presidents
yes.
their hair has gone gray in a year or two. There's all that really severe stress.
Right.
Now, the existential stress of going to Mars was very, very high. And as I like to say, after Mars, everything is cake. I enjoy just reading a newspaper in a coffee shop as a kind of like a blessing, because I was on another planet where I could have been eaten. So getting up and resting in bed on a Sunday morning becomes something sacred. And so maybe they put us on Mars, not so much to be in the program together, but they were putting future presidents in the program because there is such really hellacious stress in the presidency. So maybe they were acclimating us to that level of stress. I don't know. Maybe there was going to be some Mars liaison activity during our presidencies. I've certainly started that process by showing humanity that Mars is inhabited, both in my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, published in 2008, and in the ongoing findings of the Mars Anomaly Research Society. So maybe when we do have direct public disclosure of life on Mars, and some of the Martians, for example, are introduced in a White House press conference, maybe another president will be there to remind us that human beings from Earth are still in our positions of governance, and by then perhaps the story of both Barry and I being in the Mars Jump Room program will be told, so in that way we can facilitate the new world we're all going to be living in when there's public disclosure of the fact that Mars is inhabited and that some of its humanoids are related to us genetically and have been here both in antiquity and in modern times.
Now, when did your activities in this truth movement cause Barack Obama's involvement in the Mars Jump Room program to be known?
Right. He actually has commented in sort of a covert way, in kind of a quiet. So let me explain that. Again, it's sort of complicated. I appeared with my fellow chrononaut and Mars explorer William V. Stillings of California on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie on November 10th of 2011. And on January 4th, Barack Obama, sometime between November 10th of 2011 and January 4th of 2012, President Obama tasked Tommy Vitor, the spokesperson for the National Security Council, to plant an article in Wired.com in which President Obama satirically debunked the notion that he's ever had anything to do with Mars. Tommy Vitor had been his point man on the certificate of live birth controversy, that sidebar story in the larger birther controversy, and is a key Obama staff member. Indeed, I mean, who's on the Security Council? What, the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, Defense, the National Security Advisor, the Assistant National Security Advisor. It's a small cadre of top executive branch officials, including the President and Vice President. So the fact that he had the spokesperson for the National Security Council strongly issued the denial of our claim, which it hit the major media. It was featured on MSNBC, where curiously Brett Stillings and I were identified as retired government employees, although we were never employed by the government while serving on the Jump Room program. We weren't even given a salary or GI benefits or anything. So it went on MSNBC. It was picked up by a couple of other online journals, a couple of other major periodicals, in which the president was satirically saying through Tommy Vitor in Wired.com, not in a presidential statement from the East Room of the White House or something, that the only time he's had any contact with Mars is when he was watching Marvin of the Martians with his daughters during Saturday morning cartoons.
Okay.
So what he did was he didn't acknowledge, he didn't address whether or not he was in the Jump Room program, but what he did is issue a comedic statement that he had never been to Mars, that it makes the Obama on Mars story look sort of farcical. The problem is that they were deceiving the American people when they did that, because I was not, in later years, even though our co-trainees didn't do all of the same jumps together or missions on the surface together, I later encountered Barry in the jump room in El Segundo. I went up with him a couple of times. I went up on a staggered basis with teams of people a couple of times when he was the team members, where we would wait for 5 minutes on the surface until another, or no, it was 15 minutes on the surface until another 2 jumpers came through from El Segundo. I was on several team missions with Barry and with Bernard Mendez, with Bernard Mendez serving as team leader, just as Courtney Hunt had been a team leader with Brett and I. In fact, my favorite vignette of Barry on the surface is I was sitting on a wall looking out at the horizon of the planet, which is smaller looking because Mars is only 40% of the volume of Earth. And I watched him walk all the way in from the horizon, and he finally saw that it was me, and we just smiled at each other. I just kept on smiling, waiting for what he would say, because I wanted to get his take on how he felt now that we were jumping. He looked over at me with an air of resignation, said, "Well, now we're here." As if, yes, we were basically being brought into something pretty miserable back in summer of '80. So we interacted on the surface to that level. We were pretty much just doing the things that Bernard was asking us to do. I remember one time we began digging with a shovel and went down about 6 feet and hit metal. I don't know if it was a buried metal object or that Mars is a metallic planet covered with 6 feet of dirt. We went up. One of the times when we went up as a team of people in groups of jumpers, staggered groups of jumpers. We walked over to a ravine, and I remember Brett and I went over and stood near Barry, and he was looking into the ravine. So I think, again, among his virtues is he's a very calm person. He's not that emotional. He's a deep person. So I think he was experiencing some of the same sort of strange existential thoughts and sensations that I had. It was strange to be on the surface of Mars. Somebody mentioned that the planet obviously has a different resonance that would be different from the Schumann resonance that we have here on Earth. So even your own cells in your body will feel different. It certainly did.
Certainly.
So, there were times when, even though we hadn't been teamed, we were sometimes teamed with Bernard, and we're talking to each other and Bernard. And then there were times where there were maybe 10 people would go up in staggered groups of 2, so it would take about an hour and a half for everybody to get up to the surface through the jump room. And then we would walk around as a group of 10 or so, or 8. So he was in some of those with me, but we weren't always doing the same things with the co-trainees. So we got to know him a lot better during the training, certainly, than during our experiences on the surface. But he was on the surface, and we have 3 witnesses. I mean, people are convicted under, people are given the death penalty and jailed for life every day in this country based on the testimony of 1 person or 2 people.
Sure.
Here we have 3 people who live in 3 different disparate states in New York, California, and Washington State, of different ages and backgrounds and professional background, who insist the truth, which is that Barry was also on the surface of either Mars or whatever planetary domain they were sending us to. It certainly wasn't a virtual reality of any kind or some Earth location. I mean, we could clearly see the Martian moons Phobos and Deimos in the sky, so it wasn't any virtual reality array that would have existed at that time. It was a planetary environment. Brett and I believe that it was Mars. Bernie has been a little bit less able to accept that it was Mars because he has some challenges to the validity of that notion that are really kind of highly technical. I don't know if they're germane to this interview, but the bottom line is we were going somewhere else in time space, and it was planetary. I believe it was probably Mars. It may have been Mars via chronovision rather than teleportation, so we were there on sort of a physio-virtual basis.
Please explain what exactly is chronovision.
Well, there's 2 primary forms of time travel, and also just non-local displacement in time-space, even in real time. The first is teleportation, and that's where you open up a tunnel in time-space and go through time to a non-local location. It could be the same time, but faster than any airplane or other common conveyance will take you there, virtually instantaneously. The other kind of time travel is to bring a non-local location into the laboratory. So around the time that teleportation was developed by DARPA, they were also working with a technology that created a hologram that created a lensing effect that was so dense that they would bring a non-local event into the laboratory as a hologram. Now, the reason I think that, and that process is called chronovision. You're basically, when you stand within that hologram, you go to that location in the past or future, according to the theory of relativity, just as that event is being brought into the laboratory. There's a kind of a bilateral viewing that's going on. In fact, people from that time could potentially look at you and see through you, possibly if you started a faithful view, and see into the laboratory. Okay. Although that didn't happen because we usually disappeared much quicker than that, but that's theoretically possible. So anyway.
Now, Randy, so this chronovision, this is what you were speaking about. I remember in our original interview back in 2009 when you observed the crucifixion.
Right. Yeah, I actually observed a film of a hologram being propagated by a chronovisor of the actual crucifixion of the real person in human history named Jesus. It was Jesus' crucifixion. We're absolutely sure of that. It fit the New Testament accounts to the letter. And it looked far more real than any film could have made it as a real experience.
Wow.
But it was known to be the crucifixion. But yes, so you can either teleport or you can chronovise an image and bring it into the laboratory. So what may have been occurring, what happened was when the jumpers met, when Brett and Bernie and I contacted each other and started comparing notes about what had happened at that point, almost 30 years previously.
Barry, how did the three of you reconnect after all these years?
Well, what happened is Brett contacted me. He called me up. If I hadn't done the revealing thing and put my personal phone number on my website and email, he might not have been able to contact me, but he contacted me. And then after he and I were on coast that time on 11/10/11, which sparked the Obama quasi-denial of January 4th, 2012, Bernie then contacted us and said, in fact, Bernie reconnoitered me at a FedEx office. He actually surveilled me at a local FedEx while I was doing some of my legal work before contacting me, because I saw him in the building and recognized him, but I didn't go up to him. You don't really forget somebody who saves your life and then whose life you save on another planet. Let me say that.
Oh, you don't. No.
And so then we just began hundreds of hours of Skype conferences about our experiences. And I think at this point we're all pretty worn out from it. It was kind of traumatic to revisit the high adventure, but also the post-traumatic content, the post-traumatic stress from that set of experiences. So when we were in the jump room, they may have been chronovising Mars. So in other words, that tunnel may have been opening up to a hologram of the red planet in an exoplanetary way. In other words, they may have extended the ambit of chronovision not just from the past or future in real time, but off-planet during those 10 years of the 1970s, because chronovision had been reduced to practice by 1970. The other possibility is we were teleporting. Brett did something very intuitive when he first arrived, which is he got down on the ground and tasted the dirt to see if it was a real planet, which I think was very, very intuitive. And so it tasted like dirt. But there were some non-ordinary holographic effects that Bernie and I were involved in that suggested that something else was occurring technically, where we weren't necessarily physically on Mars as we would have been if we had gone via rocketry.
So how about the conditions? I mean, were you able to breathe? Did you have to have a breathing apparatus? What was the temperature like, the feel on your skin?
Yes. I was trained by Courtney Hunt in an abandoned chemistry lab at Cal State University Northridge in Southern California, how to use a breathing apparatus, which was like the small scuba set that you can use to do a short dive, or you might put on during a fire in an office building or something like that. Basically a miniaturized scuba device. And I had it on during my first jump in July of 1981 from the El Segundo, California jump room. And when I was met by 3 humans from Earth outside the skull that I walked out of, again, the use of faces and heads and skulls on the surface to mark access points or egress points from the underground, to and from the underground. I was met there by 3 Americans, and I kept on yelling to the one who was right in front of me, "Can I take off my mask?" And I now realize I was shouting through my communications device. So I must have made a pretty loud noise there on the surface. I could hear a dust storm over in the distance. And he said yes. And from that jump on, I never used a mask, a respirator. The air on Mars is about what air on Earth is in the 10,000 to 14,000 foot range. I had gotten that to see if I could withstand those altitudes. Courtney Hunt had driven me from Chatsworth, California, to one of those large mountains in Southern California. It must have been maybe Mount Baldy. I don't know if you can walk that. But I went up somewhere out near the San Gabriel area there and went up to many thousands of feet of altitude. And he said, so you can breathe, right? And I said, yeah. So that was a kind of a checkout for respiration on the surface. The temperature that when I was there was very, and pressure, that is humidity, was very much like, let's say, Southern California on a relatively hot spring day. It was about 70, 75 degrees and slightly humid. Mars had a kind of a sticky quality. And the atmosphere to me smelled like burnt waffles.
Burnt waffles?
Burnt waffles. If you ever burnt waffles in one of those old-fashioned waffle griddles with the red light on it,
right,
that comes on, it smelled like that. I remembered from my childhood, my mom had once burned a batch of waffles, and it smelled like they were then put out by water. It had kind of this musky, sulfuric smell.
Oh, yeah.
Brett being an amateur chemist and tinkerer in general, a technologist, said it smells like what nail polish remover smells like when you ignite it. So I wouldn't urge anybody at home to try that. It might explode, but it has a kind of an organic smell that must be all of that biomass that was buried during the flooding after that catastrophe around 11,500 BCE. That's my theory, is that it's dense with hydrocarbon production from buried vegetation.
So, Andy, you have got vivid memories, and so do at least two other comrades that you've connected with. Now,
we have specific things, yeah, that people said on the surface.
You know, sight, sound, feel, smell, taste. Now, do you think the president will ever admit to his experiences there in the Mars jump room?
Yes, yes. In fact, through an intermediary, because of course Bernard was a career intelligence officer. Brett and Barry and Regina and Willie and Barry and I were young people who had been volunteered because they wanted to send young people up there, maybe to create a permanent cadre of us, but we didn't become career intelligence officials like Bernie is or was. He's retired now. So Bernard Mendez approached the Obama administration through an intermediary, and what came back was very interesting and I think very truthful. So again, in my view, having worked with him, I think Barry Obama is showing the integrity that I remember. The first thing that came back was he remembers being in the project, Andy, and he remembers you vividly. And that was very kind. I mean, certainly when you room with somebody, you tend to remember them over time. And he said, but the project itself seems very vague in my memory. And that may be because we were all subjected to brainwashing before we left the program. I mean, at least Brett and I were. I don't know if Barry and Regina and the others were. But we were, right?
To erase the memories of the experiences?
To basically compartmentalize on that. This would be not mind control or entrainment, which mind control implies. It would be basically the electronic suppression of memory, having your memories suppressed. Nothing can be erased in the mind short of organically cutting out a piece of the brain, because everything that happens to us and every part of our consciousness, everything we think, remains stored in engrams in the different neural networks in the brain. So everything's up there, but they had ways electronically of compartmentalizing your memories around a certain topic. And mine remained in check until 2 years after I wrote my paper about Mars. I published it in 2008.
I've got to ask this question. How do you know those experiences were not programmed in? How do you know that these
Well, let me answer it this way. Ultimately, you don't know if any particular thing in your life could have been from another cause. I mean, our last trip to a McDonald's could have been being taken aboard a UFO from another civilization in space, modeling a McDonald's to try to figure out what people are doing when they're walking in those strange buildings with the golden arches. In other words, all claims of an ordinary or a non-ordinary nature are vulnerable to the collateral attack that they resulted from being implanted or resulted from hypnosis, brainwashing, mind control, whatever you want to call it. The reason that I know that the jump room program happened is the same reason, for example, that I know that my time travel experiences in Project Pegasus happened.
This happened in the 60s when you were a child.
Right. In the late 60s, early 70s, when I was age 7 to 11, and then I was in the jump room program from age 18 to 22. I know these things happened because they stretched over days. There were different kinds of activities, including the training and getting prepared to jump and jumping. There were later corroborations of details that were extremely physical. Like, for example, when Brett's father showed me how to use the flash gun in their backyard in La Cañada and incinerated a baby goat, so that when I went over to the goat's location, said, okay, blow on it, and see what happens. And the ashes from the goat were so feathery, the goat just collapsed. I mean, they were just highly specific and also highly terrifying information.
Certainly.
So the reality, what it did to me physically, and also, let me add, physical evidence. For example, one time, after coming back from Mars, it was actually my second jump with Courtney Hunt. I went up by myself in July of '81. And then during my second training jump, or checkout jump, Courtney Hunt went with me, and we walked for about 3 or 4 hours on the surface. He dropped me off at Mason and Devonshire in Chatsworth, and I walked home. But despite that roughly half-mile walk to where my family's house was, I walked into our house in Chatsworth with the red dust of Mars all over my shoes. And my mother challenged me, and she said, Andrew, your shoes are filthy. How did you get all that red dust all over your shoes? And we were trained to lie to anybody who did not have a need to know what we were doing. It was a human survival critical mission from the perspective of the U.S. government.
Sure.
And I told Mom, I was down at the gas station down at Mason, Devonshire, and there's a little patch of dirt behind there, and somebody had thrown a bunch of spark plugs there, and they were rusting. So I was talking to somebody, one of the guys who works at the station there, and just kicking that dust, and I got that reddish earth all over from the rusted spark plugs all over my shoes. In fact, it was the dust of Mars. So my mother wasn't brainwashed. Now, a cynic would say, well, they brainwashed you to believe that you were talking to your mother. No. I walked into our house in Chatsworth with fine red particles of dust all over my shoes, my hiking boots.
Right.
So there's all kinds of collateral support for our memories that take it out of the ambit of the people working with us, like Major Ed Dames, who could have even effectuated brainwashing in an extended, multi-episodic kind of way. And so, I mean, we even have the name of one of the Navy attaches at the El Segundo jump room site, and found that he's now the dean of a business school in the South. So we've profiled the participants, and we're either going to allow them to come forward and tell what they know, or we're going to start catching them in prevarication. So we know that what happened to us for, among other reasons, the fact that Bernard was not one of the teenage jumpers. He was older, and he was there as a participant observer to investigate the jump room program with prior knowledge from his briefings that they were utilizing this advanced technology to put American chrononauts on Mars. So there's different frames of reference. There's different, not just various forms of evidence, but different ways of shifting between domains of the perspective of the participants to then be able to establish that it didn't just all occur in our minds. It was an actual program of exploration that the U.S. government had secretly launched.
Well, this technology has some very strong implications. This could change everyone's life on the planet for the better. I mean, imagine if there's some sort of an event where there's an earthquake or there's some natural disaster where people need food, clothing, medicine. You can get in a flash. You don't have to travel by plane or boat. You just put it in this jump room.
Yes, and in fact, think of the potential in a famine to set up either a teleporter or a jump room where there are food supplies, and set up kind of a backstop in a field where the famine's going on, and not get the food there 72 hours or 7 days or 10 days when people are dying from starvation.
Right.
But we send emergency food supplies with pull-top cans and stuff where they can eat right there in the field with the stuff being thrown through time-space, either teleporting or then in a jump room, it would arrive as a cargo room, like an elevator, maybe even with a human operator. And then the walls could fall off, and there you'd have emergency relief supplies delivered almost instantaneously. Now that may be a means to help, literally at some point, billions of human beings, because if we have a global coastal flooding event, we're in trouble because 70% of humanity lives within a 1-hour car drive of an ocean. So even getting remaining food supplies to people at higher ground is going to be difficult with all of the ports and all of the airports and coastal cities underwater. So if we're going to help people, if we're going to move the food on the planet around after some catastrophic event, let's say a meteor lands in the Atlantic Ocean and the Empire State Building has been flooded up to its 18th floor and 180 feet of water, which, by the way, could happen if the East Antarctic ice shelf melted. So there are many future events that may be quite catastrophic, and I'm calling for the declassification of teleportation so that humanity can use it and be advantaged by it in the 21st century.
Yes, I'm in total agreement. If we do have that technology, it's so important that it is utilized. But you know, Andy, do you believe that some secrecy is important in national security?
Yes. If I'm elected president, I'm going to be the truth president. But that doesn't mean full disclosure of all information the government has. There are two major areas where it would be absolutely the misprision, malfeasance of office to introduce full transparency. The first is where the release of information would create a clear and present danger. For example, we wouldn't want transparency regarding how to build a thermonuclear weapon,
right,
or the government's information about who might direct a thermonuclear weapon in a major city, and so forth. So in his service as Commander-in-Chief, the President still needs a zone of secrecy to prevent clear and present dangers and to protect the country and literally to protect international peace. And that doesn't mean, however, if something is esoteric and the government's saying that psychologically it would destabilize the population of the world, it shouldn't be released. So an example of that, something that should be disclosed, is what has been the nature and extent of visitation by extraterrestrials to our planet, and what has been the nature and extent of the U.S. government and other major world governments' involvement with extraterrestrials in direct liaison.
Mm-hmm.
That is not an international or national security issue, except to this extent that it's more likely that we will miscarry our responsibilities as a global civilization if we have too few human beings in liaison with extraterrestrial civilizations and we don't do the right things. So my argument there would be that the ET cover-up is something that should fall under the standard of clear and present danger, because it's clearly not a clear and present danger to tell people, hey, we live in an inhabited universe. The second major area would be the area of privacy. The U.S. government, different agencies and departments of it, regularly gather information about people's private lives. The IRS gathers people's financial data. Somebody will be under criminal investigation by the FBI and they'll find out aspects of their personal life that are nobody's business, etc. There are many areas of personal privacy that are in no way facts that the people must know to remain free citizens of a republic. And I would also draw a zone of secrecy around the government not releasing private information unless there's the same compelling, narrowly tailored state interest that we require, for example, in the area of equal protection when we discriminate based on race and gender and under other fundamental characteristics. Well, essentially it's evolved into a compelling state interest needing to be shown where race and gender are being used as the criterion. So I would model the standard regarding privacy of what you wouldn't disclose in a truth-governed country on, is there a compelling state interest in revealing something that's private that under ordinary circumstances should not be revealed? So an example might be What if the vice president covertly found out or married a wife who was actually a citizen of another country? That goes to the privacy of that couple. Who would want a secret like that revealed to everybody, that his wife was not an American, but was born, let's say, in Russia or something like that, or from Russia? That would be of compelling state interest, however, because we need to know what might influence the actions of our executive branch officials, including what their spouses might advise regarding a given emergency or decision or issue or what have you. So there are areas where we don't want a fully transparent presidency and government, but I think those are the only two areas. I think, for example, the existence of the fact that we were putting U.S. chrononauts on Mars before 1980 is something that should be told to the American people.
Mm-hmm.
I see it doesn't create a clear and present danger. Only the privacy of the jumpers is involved, and there were many of them. So even after the jump room program would be disclosed, not every jumper's identity would be disclosed, unless they wanted to have their participation disclosed and publicly revealed and discussed. And there's no compelling national interest in concealing the fact that we had such a program. I think during the Cold War, secrecy became the abiding standard of government procedure. That was the problem.
Yes.
And they made programs secret that certainly after 30 years should not be kept secret. It certainly wouldn't be jeopardizing the program for a president to announce the existence of this program. So I've been asked, what would you ask Barack Obama to do now that he's president? And I would say, well, how about have his group that he was in and himself appear in the Rose Garden or the East Room or something and be given the Space Medal for our service? That would be an excellent segue into discussing what we accomplished over 30 years ago, sending Americans to Mars, or at least sending them off planet utilizing the jump room technology. I mean, I would be happy to pin the Space Medal on his jacket because he was one of us. And so I think that would be an excellent moment for the president to make good on his promise that he ran on in 2008 to be a transparent president and have the most open administration in U.S. history, because here we have his own involvement about a major aspect of the secret space program that I think would be fascinating for the American people to learn, and we certainly served with valor at the risk of our own lives and were never recognized. So I mean, that I think would be one way of handling the disclosure in a way that would simultaneously recognize that these were Americans in their teens who were going to another country with no guarantee that we would return.
Right.
It was a country pretty much devoid of technology on the surface, fairly devoid of water, certainly devoid of food supplies, and a planet being roamed by vicious predators. And those of us who did return were the lucky ones. And so I would think something like that. Maybe even have every living jumper who wants to participate be invited, let's say, to the football stadium at Rice University in Texas. And President Obama could do a kind of an updating of President Kennedy's speech there at Rice of September 12th, 1962, and update the American people on what we've done in space as a country. You may recall in that speech, President Kennedy spoke of going to the moon and doing the other things. Well, one of the other things was using the jump room technology to explore another planet. And I see no good reason for that to be concealed after 30 years. So that's what I would suggest to him. Why don't you have a medal ceremony, and that will simultaneously explain that while this was covered up, it still was a program of exploration, and one in which the American people can be proud that their fellow citizens, who are really still youngsters, were serving with valor and distinction in the program.
So, Andrew Basiago, are you running for president in 2016?
Yes, I am. I'm running for president in 2016, come hell or high water. I'm not predicting a global coastal flooding event before then, but I'm running, and I hope that my fellow citizens vote for me. I'm going to be trying to get on every state ballot as an independent. That probably won't be possible because some of the state requirements are absolutely unjust in terms of getting on the ballot as an independent. But I'll try to get on every state ballot, and I'm authentically running, and I'm going to be talking about these issues, because if the United States government was to do just one thing under presidential leadership, and that's declassify and deploy the Tesla teleportation that had been reduced to practice safely by 1970, the U.S. government and people could lead the world in establishing a new energy paradigm, linking major cities of the world with teleportation, and we would reestablish our leadership as a country that can do things and that can literally transform the world. In my view, that's what we were supposed to be as a country. The United States was supposed to be the fulfillment of an intellectual movement that began in Europe called the Enlightenment. And we have seen major improvement in certain areas of society. But we haven't maintained our profile as the country that put men on the moon. Because around that time when we finally had gone to the moon, certainly by the mid-1970s, we were beginning to conceal our technology, the technical feats we were achieving, like Tesla teleportation, like the jump rooms, and we were also concealing the heroic acts that we were performing going to other planets. And that's something that no president should be concealing at this point. So if President Obama doesn't want to take the lead on this, as a candidate, I'm going to be, and that's one of the major things I'm going to be calling for, is a truth presidency that will, based on the South African model of truth and reconciliation, establish a truth process in the United States government so that the breakaway civilization that is now forming can be dissolved, and so all the people of the world can participate, at least vicariously, in these things that have been accomplished and that will define the 21st century.
Oh, excellent. Oh, Andy Basiago, thank you so much for joining us here on Solutions Live. This is a Flagstaff hangout for Solutions, and you've been the very first victim. Thank you so much. Please, as we begin to lead out and conclude, I would just love for you to share with our viewers how they can find out more about you, to read your reports, to contact you. Please.
Well, I have two websites that I established when I began my truth campaign. Back in 2008, after I began lecturing in 2004 about my experiences. My time travel papers, I'm several years behind editing and putting out my new papers, but they're at the Annals of Project Pegasus, which is a feature of my website, projectpegasus.net. And then my Mars papers, in which I present my own findings of ancient artifacts and biological beings on the red planet, as well as the best findings of the leading Mars anomalists who are the leading members of my research organization, the Mars Anomaly Research Society. I'm about 2,000 discoveries behind. That's how the Mars research has been picking up speed. But those papers are at the Annals of Mars, capital M-A-R-S, at projectmars.net. Now, in the last several years, where I've been speaking more frequently on TV and radio and not keeping those websites up with new papers, I've established several Facebook groups that are really exploding in membership. The first is my time travel group, which is called Project Pegasus. So if any of your viewers want to join that, they may be the 10,000th member. I'm going to recognize the 10,000th member coming up here in July sometime.
Great. And
I also have about 3,700 members of what's called Mars Anomaly Research Society. And that's where we have kind of a design charrette. We don't put our leading discoveries there. We just let every member who's legitimately engaged in Mars Anomaly research, who has real data to share, they can post it there at Mars Anomaly Research Society, and then there's kind of a group discussion about what that data may show. I did that because, well, like intellectual quotient, like IQ, there's something called PQ, which is perception quotient. So individuals fall on a bell curve of perception. Some people can't perceive things they've never seen before. A large group of people in the middle can sometimes see anomalous objects and figure out what they are. And then there are some gifted percipients over on the right side of the bell curve. So given the fact that that's unique to every individual, it's based on vision, it's based on learning when they're an infant. Some people kind of refer to images in their memory. Other people can grapple with new shapes and things and make sense of them. I decided to let anybody who wanted to join that organization scrutinize everybody else's data, while then periodically enriching the group with the leading findings of some of the best anomalies, or those who've been fortunate enough to find some really remarkable things. For example, Ross Curley of our organization found a carving of the face of a pharaoh, complete with a conical headdress and the cobra ready to strike motif of the high Egyptian civilization. carved into a rock on Mars. So we're really finding some incredible anomalies on the surface. So that way we can have everybody participate in looking for data and presenting what they think shows something or that might show something. And then let as many eyes as possible look at that anomaly and grapple with what's in it, or whether there's anything in it at all. But also then periodically brief the group on the leading findings. And those are stored at the at projectmars.net. But we're growing in interest because there are many people actually around the world who are actively scrutinizing NASA and the European Space Agency's Mars images. And even though there's a lot of things that have been done to some of those images to distort what's in them, there's evidence that shows to a disposing certainty that Mars is an inhabited planet, not just a planet that was once inhabited. And it's inhabited with humanoids that are similar to us, and also animal species that resemble Earth species, that resemble Earth species, current Earth species that are extinct, hybrids of living and extinct Earth species, and also living animals on Mars that have never existed on Earth. For example, my discovery of what we call the striding gremlin is sort of a humanoid that looks like a toad that walks on two sharp legs. So there are life forms on Mars that literally cause amazement when you identify them, and that make the process of being an armchair Mars explorer probably one of the funnest hobbies that you can think of on Earth, because you're literally looking at evidence from another planet and seeing something significant for the first time. So you're seeing what an explorer during the Age of Discovery would find when they pulled their ship and up to the coast and got out in smaller boats and rowed in, and they found a new form of flower or something, or an animal that they never saw before.
Never seen.
Yeah, so the thrill of that is what Mars is providing, and as a result, we're burgeoning as a group. And so I would invite any of your viewers to join the Mars Anomaly Research Society on Facebook, maybe make a donation. We're listed as a nonprofit corporation in the state of Washington. We're incorporated as a nonprofit. We've received several $100s in donations in the 5 years we've been a nonprofit in Washington. I've been funding the organization through my earnings as a lawyer, as I've been funding my truth campaign about time travel in the Mars Jump Room program. So that's where the data is. The data is not going away. We're going to be having more whistleblowers come forward. We've now identified 17 people who were connected to the Jump Room program. Most of them jumped. Some are deceased. But we think as many as 10 living people could be identified as jumpers. We don't have the identity of the 5 other students in the class. Several of those may come forward. So I want my old friend Barry to know that, I hold him in very high esteem. But if I reach his high office, I'm going to be doing something different, and something I would urge him to do so that I don't have to, which is reveal the existence of the Jump Room program, so Americans can be proud of it, and they can know what we did with our ability to work in teams and judge people by the content of their character and use their God-given gifts to achieve national goals and do great things, and use our identity as a country as the embodiment of the Enlightenment to do what the founders did, which is set the world ablaze. And that's what I think such an acknowledgement would do. I think it would be wonderful for one of the participants who's reached the presidency to do that. So it's either going to be our old fellow chrononaut, Barack Obama, or it's going to be me if I reach the presidency. Or maybe another president will work with us to reveal the existence of this program.
Excellent. I thank you so much for joining us. And Andy will make sure that we put those links. I'll get those from you. We'll put those links so they'll be right there on the YouTube channel. And everybody can go over there and enjoy and take pride in the technology that our country has created. And give thanks for those pioneers such as yourself and Barry.
Right. We were volunteers, and so for those who would criticize the president, I hope now after this interview, Tamara, they know that he not only went to Mars as a young man with valor, as we all did, but it was pure public service. We weren't paid. We weren't placed on the GI Bill of Rights. We weren't given military decorations. There was no parade when we got back. And I think that was the highest form of public service, which is dangerous voluntary service, uncompensated. So that's the way I would ask them to evaluate Barack Obama, the individual. by that very fact that he participated in that kind of program voluntarily as a young man.
Excellent. Well, I thank you all for joining us here on Solutions Live. Again, always seek the solutions. We all know what the problems are. Peace and blessings.